hate you, Mando. Because you're a legend.
This is me in the 1980s, sitting in front of my ZX Spectrum, completely absorbed, like so many kids of that era discovering home computing for the first time. I was born in 1981, which often leads people to label me as a millennial or a zennial, but those generation boxes don't really capture the reality I lived. Generations, after all, are tiny ideas imposed after the fact. Originally, Generation X was considered to span from 1965 to 1985. Later in the 90s, that definition shifted, ending in 1980 instead. On paper, that placed me outside of it. But real life isn't lived on paper. It's shaped by environments, timing, and the people you are around. Because my birthday fell right on the UK academic cut-off, I was given a choice that most people never even think about. I could either be the youngest in the final Generation X year, or I could be the oldest in the first millennial year. I chose to join the last Gen X year. That decision quietly shaped everything that followed. My classmates saw me as one of them. We shared the same cultural references, the same playground conversations, the same sense of what growing up meant at that time. Those everyday interactions, what you might call a person's microsystems, matter more than abstract demographic labels. Identity is formed in small repeated moments of belonging. I remember being a part of that last cohort in school to sing God Save the Queen in assembly and traditional hymns, something that was phased out by 1988. It felt like standing at the tail end of an old world, just before a quiet but meaningful shift in how schools approach traditions, values, and shared rituals. In the playground, I watched the rise of My Little Pony, Transformers, and the explosion of many cartoons that defined that decade. Those weren't just shows, they were shared cultural anchors, shaping imagination and social bonds in a very special moment in time. Then my path diverged. Because of severe learning difficulties, I was taken out of mainstream education and placed in a special unit. Suddenly, the structure that I had defined my peer group dissolved. With fewer children, age boundaries blurred. My friendships were no longer determined by school year, but by circumstances. I found myself gravitating towards older students, children who were born in 1978 and 1979. They became my daily world, my new microsystem. Their perspectives, their interests, cultural references, all slightly older, all slightly different, became the ones that influenced me the most. Psychologically, it's a reminder that identity isn't just about when you were born, but who you're growing alongside. Time may be linear, but experience is not. We don't grow up in generations, we grow up in communities. That's why the label of millennial or zennial have never felt right for me. They ignore the texture and lived experience, the unusual paths, the small decisions, and the unexpected environments that shaped me. Even though I worked hard, the system boxed me in early. My English and maths results limited my choices on paper, pushing me into the arts not by passion alone, but by necessity. After leaving secondary school, I went to the same art school as Liz Hurley, although by then any sense of glamour had gone. Coming from a strict background, I reinvented myself, but standing out quickly became a problem, as being different was treated with suspicion. One day I was in the art studio and I was pulled out of class by 2 security guards and questioned without representation and strip searched. The reason felt surreal. After the Columbine massacre, unfortunately for me, I wore a black trench coat. That was enough to make me a suspect, despite living in the UK with no firearms. They found nothing, but I was still watched, harassed, and quietly pushed towards leaving. I learned that through a psychologist's connection to the headmaster that there had been discussions about forcing me out. Not long after this psychologist shared his information with me, he decided to commit suicide, leaving everything unresolved. At the same time, my story seemed to have spread beyond the school in golf clubs across the south of England. Strangers already seemed to know my story, as if I had become part of rumour or legend. It felt like I had lost control of my own narrative. And the most surreal thing about all this all happened before any social networking platform. So before MySpace, before Facebook, before any of these things. To have utter strangers just walk up to you and seem to know you and know everything about you was very strange at that time. Looking back, that time feels shaped by fear and projection, where perception easily replaced truth. After leaving art school, I drifted, and education no longer felt like a place of growth. I became a freelance artist and apprenticed under Jules Hartley. If you were around Cyberdog, Camden in the late 90s and early 2000s, you probably saw my work. That world was raw, experimental, and alive. At the same time I was building for the early internet, a friend and I launched a venture together, creating websites for clients including BBC Robot Wars Team Mortis. This was at the start of Web 2.0. I was designing, skinning, building levels, working on sprites, voxels, and early mesh work, learning by doing right at the edge of what was possible. Through friends, I even had links to IDOS and Lionhood Studios. For a moment, it felt like takeoff. Then the dot-com bubble burst and everything stalled. What followed was drift. I couldn't access higher education until I qualified as a mature student, so I was stuck in limbo, skilled, experienced, but locked out. When I finally got in, I studied fashion and graduated in 2009, only to be hit by another global financial crisis. Bad timing became a pattern. From leaving school to finishing university, the economy never really gave my generation a clean shot, and this is why many Generation X don't have a pot to piss in. So I adapted. I went into retail and worked my way up to an area manager, but even that wasn't enough to build a life, not enough to bring my wife to the UK. Immigration rules had been tightened under Theresa May. The financial threshold became a wall. I tried to climb it the only way I could. Work more, work harder. At one point I was working 3 jobs, from 4 a.m. in the morning to 11 o'clock at night, 6 days a week. I lasted 6 months. Fatigue and heart palpitations. I nearly killed myself trying. In the end I missed the requirements by £60. That's when it clicked. This wasn't bad luck, it was structural. I'd done everything right and still couldn't get through. The system wasn't built to flex, it was built to filter. So I stopped trying to force it, because sometimes the smart move is not to push harder, it's to recognize when the game itself isn't worth playing, and to find somewhere better to build your life. So I packed up what little I had and walked away from a game that was never really built for me to win. And speaking about the UK, there's only 2 types of people who can win, and you can figure it out. When I arrived in China in 2015, the rules for foreigners were clear on paper, but in reality, chaotic. If you wanted to stay long term, you needed a job, and this meant only one thing: teaching. In theory, there were standards. In practice, it often felt like the Wild West, where many schools operated with little oversight, and they were putting their workers in dangerous legal waters. Before leaving the UK, I had done everything properly. I had got an advanced criminal background check, a teaching qualification, and real classroom experience. I expected those to matter, but on the first day it became obvious that they didn't. Over 95% of the staff had none of these credentials, and this wasn't unusual. Across many private schools at the time, demand for English teachers was booming, and enforcement of hiring standards lagged behind. It created an environment where, frankly, children weren't always in the safest or most professional hands. I stood out immediately, not just because of my qualifications, but for my age. I was in my late 30s, surrounded by mostly people in their early 20s. Many of them weren't there for teaching as a career, they were there for the lifestyle. There was even a nickname floating around back then, LBH, short for loser back home. Harsh, but it stuck because the majority fit that stereotype. Showing up to class hungover, teaching a few hours, heading straight back out to drink and party again, day in, day out. I didn't fit into that rhythm and didn't enjoy the atmosphere. Campus life was dominated by cliques and petty politics, often shaped by nationality or background. I kept my distance. The same went for how foreigners behaved outside work. On the metro, for example, many of the foreigners would just brush past security checks, as if the rules didn't apply to them. I followed the local norms, bagged through the security checks. It earned me a few looks, even ridicule, but to me it was simple: respect the country you're in. Keeping to myself came at a cost, because I didn't play along with the internal politics. Management passed me over for opportunities. Still, I wasn't too bothered, as I saw the first year as a soft landing, a chance to understand the country rather than chase status or money. Ironically, on paper, I was exactly what the school claimed they wanted: a qualified native speaker from the United Kingdom. When my contract ended, they assumed I'd renew. That was the pattern most people did, but in a meeting I declined. It caught them off guard. Suddenly there were better offers, more money, more opportunities. They were used to thinking that every foreigner had a price. They misread the situation. I hadn't come to be looking to be bought, and their games were about to backfire, getting in trouble from their head office for losing a valuable asset. The reason being is at that time the writing was on the wall about how the industry was being run, that schools wouldn't be able to hire non-natives in the future. So to lose a native out of 100 foreign workers they had, a serious loss for me to leave. The next opportunity felt like a step up. In my second year, I decided to actually use my experience and qualifications this time, and it landed me a role with Sesame Street English, backed by a wealthy industrial investor. On the surface, it looked promising, but beneath all that, there were different priorities. Profit first, education second. Looking back, there were warning signs I didn't catch. Some of it came down to language barriers, some cultural differences, some were my own optimism. I walked in assuming good faith. I even accepted far less than I should have. At the time, a principal was earning about $30,000 a month, but I agreed to about half of that, with the understanding that when things improved, I would get a pay bump. I kept my side of the deal. That year, I worked relentlessly. I wasn't just a principal. I built the curriculum from scratch because what we'd been given was unusable. I organized events, trained the teachers, managed the operation, and kept everything in place and functioning. It felt less like a job and more like holding together a fragile machine. Then, near the end of my contract, everything shifted. My wife became pregnant, and suddenly the stakes became much higher. I made it very clear to the owner that my visa needed to be handled properly. I even offered to take a pay cut to bring in a specialist to make sure that my paperwork was done by the book. The risk of getting it wrong wasn't abstract. It could mean deportation, right where my family needed me the most. But as the weeks passed, nothing was done. The closer we got to the expiry date, the more obvious it became that they had not taken it seriously at all. On the very last day, my wife and I rushed to immigration to switch from a work visa to a marriage visa, just to stay legally. All the while, my boss was giving dangerous advice to me, telling me that I didn't need a visa to live in China. Switching visas solved one problem but created another. Without a valid work visa, I couldn't legally work. I refused to break the law, and that's when things got ugly. They started making threats, intimidation, and even a laughable blackmail attempt to force me back into the classroom. At that point, I cut all ties with them. Within 3 months, the entire staff collapsed. They tried to replace me with several other foreign teachers, but it all failed. by the time they understood what I'd actually been doing, it was already too late. I hadn't just been an employee, I had been the one holding the entire operation together, quietly keeping everything moving like a one-man army. In the end, they lost over $1 million investment and customers. It didn't have to be that way. If they had simply handled my visa correctly, their school might have survived. Instead, they learned the hard way that you can't run an operation on shortcuts and assumptions. Please give us a sub, as our channel really needs it.